We have extreme heat warnings in effect Wednesday and Thursday.
Extreme heat warnings mean certain popular hiking trails, including parts of Camelback Mountain, Piestewa Peak, and South Mountain, close from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. to protect hikers and first responders. Phoenix Fire has responded to almost 80 mountain rescues so far this year. Department leaders say that's a 50% increase from this same time last year. And summer isn't over, and they expect that number to increase, including people who hike when a trail is closed and they end up calling 911. When a hiker is rescued in that situation, what happens? Well, right now, violating closure signs can result in fines or community service. Some Phoenix Fire officials have expressed how frustrating it is when people ignore the closed trail signs, while emphasizing that no matter what, rescuers will answer every call. And that's where the Phoenix Parks and Recreation Board comes in. I reached out to the board asking if there have been any talks about creating stricter policies that can hold those hikers accountable. The response stated that the board is meeting this week, but that topic is not on the agenda.
And I've requested an interview with the Parks and Recs board to ask when the last citation was issued and really just to sit down and talk about this. I have not yet heard back. That next meeting is Thursday night. In Phoenix tonight, Stephanie Dupre reporting for Arizona's Family.